Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that sounds completely harmless. Something your mum probably bought at the pharmacy. Something that sits on the shelf between the antacids and the nasal strips. Something that has a little drowsy warning on the label and a little cartoon cough on the box. We're talking about Dextromethorphan, DXM, the active ingredient in Robitussin, NyQuil, and approximately 400 other products that your local CVS stocks in bulk. And before we go any further, thank you sincerely and genuinely to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are. Every time someone takes the time to leave a comment or send in an idea, it genuinely shapes what this channel becomes. So thank you. If you enjoyed tonight's video, like it, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always 1 a.m. somewhere, and I respect that deeply. Also, the channel is now on Spotify. Links in the description. Throw it on, close your eyes, and let history do its thing. Now, dim the lights, put on a fan, pull the blanket up, get genuinely comfortable, because tonight's story is equal parts absurd, horrifying, and deeply embarrassing for the American pharmaceutical industry. Because here's what we need to pause and really sit with for a moment. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to get high on cough syrup? Have you ever looked at a bottle of Robitussin and thought, who decided this was a good idea? Who was the first teenager to chug this and think, yeah, this is medicine, and I'm going to do it recreationally? Why were there entire internet forums dedicated to calculating the exact milligrams per kilogram of body weight? Why did convenience stores start locking this stuff behind the counter? Why is there a law in several American states that says you have to be 18 to buy cold medicine? And why did an entire generation of American teenagers refer to getting high on cough syrup as robo-tripping and consider it a reasonable Friday night? Congratulations. You've just woken up somewhere in suburban America in the early 2000s. There's a CVS on every corner. The internet is young and feral and nobody's monitoring it. And somewhere in a teenager's bedroom, there's a bottle of Robitussin and a plan that seemed a lot smarter before it happened. Let's start at the very beginning, because if you're going to understand how cough syrup became a youth drug crisis, you first need to understand what dextromethorphan actually is, and the answer is stranger than you'd expect. DXM, as it's casually known, is a synthetic compound first developed in the 1950s as a non-addictive alternative to codeine, which was the cough suppressant of choice at the time, and came with the minor inconvenience of being, well, an opiate. The idea was simple: suppress the cough reflex without getting people hooked on narcotics. And DXM did exactly that, at normal doses. The problem, as the coming decades would reveal, is that DXM at normal doses is a very different substance from DXM at 10 or 15 times the recommended amount. At standard doses, it's boring. At higher doses, it becomes something else entirely, a dissociative hallucinogen that shares more in common with ketamine than it does with anything your pediatrician had in mind. So what exactly is it doing in your body when you take it correctly? At a therapeutic dose, something in the range of 15 to 30 milligrams, DXM acts on a specific region of your brainstem called the cough center, essentially telling it to calm down and stop sending the signal that makes your diaphragm spasm every 45 seconds. It does this without making you feel particularly good, without creating any notable euphoria, and without giving your brain any compelling reason to want more of it. It's about as recreational as a throat lozenge. You take it, your cough quiets down, you go to sleep, you wake up feeling roughly the same as before minus the cough. That's the intended experience. That's the whole thing. There is no mystery here at recommended doses. The mystery only begins when someone looks at the label, sees 15 to 30 milligrams and thinks, what happens at 300? That question, it turns out, has a very long and very specific answer. Because DXM at high doses stops being a cough suppressant and starts being something pharmacologists classify as a dissociative anesthetic. It binds to NMDA receptors, the same receptors that ketamine and PCP act on, and begins interfering with the brain's ability to process sensory information normally. The world starts to feel unreal. Your body starts to feel distant. Time gets strange and elastic. Colours shift. Sounds become amplified or muffled in ways that don't correspond to anything in the external environment. You are, chemically speaking, experiencing a state that has more in common with a surgical dissociative agent than with anything sold in the cough and cold aisle, and you got there with something your grandmother keeps in her bathroom cabinet. This is the central absurdity of the DXM story, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. You're not talking about a clandestine laboratory substance, a street drug cut with mystery compounds, or something smuggled across borders in vacuum-sealed bags. You're talking about an ingredient found in Robitussin, Nyquil, Dayquil, Theraflu, Delsim, Mucinex DM, and somewhere between 150 and 400 other products, depending on which year you're counting in. It is in the medicine aisle of every major pharmacy in America. It is behind the counter at gas stations. It is in your medicine cabinet right now, almost certainly, wrapped in cheerful packaging with a person breathing easily on the front. The cough is gone. Everything is fine. And for the vast majority of people who take it, everything is fine. That's important to say. Millions of Americans use DXM appropriately every year, suppress their coughs, recover from their colds, and never think about it again. The problem was never the medicine. The problem was the gap between what the medicine was designed to do and what it turned out to be capable of doing. A gap that a generation of teenagers discovered, documented, and distributed to each other over the early internet with an enthusiasm that the pharmaceutical industry was entirely unprepared for. The cough syrup was just sitting there. Someone read the label too carefully. And then everything got complicated. Before DXM, cough medicine was a chaotic, largely unregulated adventure through the most terrifying pharmacy imaginable. You have to understand that for most of medical history, a cough was treated with whatever happened to be available, and what was available was often alarming. Opium-based syrups were sold freely throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, often to children, often without any meaningful warning. Heroin, yes, actual heroin, was briefly marketed by Bayer as a cough suppressant in the early 1900s. Codeine held the position of respectable cough suppressant for decades afterward, and while it did suppress coughs rather well, it also suppressed people's sense of caution around taking more than the label suggested. When the FDA began tightening control over narcotics in the mid-20th century, pharmaceutical companies were suddenly left looking for something, anything, that could fill the cough syrup shelf without requiring a prescription or a moral reckoning. Imagine being a pharmacist in the early 1900s. Someone walks in with a cough. You hand them a bottle. The bottle contains opium. You both feel fine about this. This is Tuesday. This is medicine. The concept that perhaps giving people opium for a common cold might have some downstream complications does not appear to be keeping anyone up at night, because the concept of downstream complications is not yet a major part of the pharmaceutical conversation. The 1900s are a different time. People are dying of things we now vaccinate against. Opium for a cough is, relatively speaking, not the most alarming thing on the shelf, but the opium doesn't stay. As the 20th century develops and the science of addiction begins to take shape, regulators start paying attention to what's actually in the medicine cabinet. The Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 begins restricting opiates. The regulatory environment tightens through the 20s, 30s, and 40s. By the mid-century, pharmaceutical companies are facing a genuine scientific and commercial problem. The most effective cough suppressants are also addictive narcotics, and the government is increasingly reluctant to let those narcotics sit on open shelves next to the aspirin. So the search begins. Laboratories across the country are tasked with finding something that will quiet a cough, without activating the brain's reward system in the way that opiates do. This is in principle a reasonable and admirable scientific goal. The challenge is that the cough reflex and the brain's pleasure circuitry are not neatly separated. They're part of the same extraordinarily complex organ, and interfering with one without touching the other is a genuinely difficult problem. Several compounds are tried, several fail in various ways. And then, in the mid-1950s, researchers at Roche Laboratories synthesize dextromethorphan, test it on humans, find that it suppresses coughs effectively and produces no meaningful euphoria at therapeutic doses, and conclude that the problem has been solved. They are not entirely wrong. DXM does suppress coughs effectively. It does not produce meaningful euphoria at therapeutic doses. What the researchers either did not know or did not prioritize investigating is what happens at doses significantly above therapeutic, which is, as you now know, a rather different story. The clinical trials that brought DXM to market were not designed to test what happens when someone takes 10 times the recommended amount, because that scenario was not considered a realistic risk. People take the recommended amount. People read labels. People are sensible. It is the 1950s. The future is bright and full of synthetic chemicals solving problems that used to require opiates, and nobody's going to abuse cough syrup. That would be ridiculous. Within 2 decades, it would become clear that this optimism was, at best, premature. DXM was synthesized and approved by the FDA in 1958, which means the United States government officially decided that this compound was safe enough to go into over-the-counter medicine during the same decade that people were still advertising cigarettes as healthy. Context matters. The compound was developed by Roche Laboratories, a pharmaceutical giant that was also responsible for several other mid-century drugs that would later cause significant problems, which is perhaps less of a coincidence and more of a pattern. At therapeutic doses, the 15 to 30 milligrams in a regular cough syrup serving, DXM is genuinely unremarkable. It suppresses the cough reflex by acting on the brain's cough center, makes you a little drowsy, and wears off in a few hours. The fact that consuming 10 to 20 times that amount produces vivid hallucinations, complete dissociation from your body, and what users would later describe on the internet as plateaus of increasingly intense altered states, that was not in the marketing brochure. The 1950s were, broadly speaking, a decade of enormous optimism about synthetic chemistry. The war had ended. Penicillin was working miracles. Polio was being defeated. The idea that science could solve any problem, including the problem of the common cough, felt not just plausible but obvious. Laboratories were producing new compounds at a pace that regulation genuinely struggled to match, and the general cultural assumption was that if something came from a lab and was approved by experts, it was probably fine. This assumption was not unreasonable given the available information. It was also, in several notable cases, catastrophically wrong. DXM would prove to be the long-delayed version of that lesson. The FDA approval process for DXM in 1958 assessed the compound against one primary question: does it suppress coughs, and is it safe at the doses required to suppress coughs? The answer to both was yes, and the compound was approved. What the process did not systematically assess, could not have assessed, given what was known at the time, was what the compound did at doses far above therapeutic, what its interaction with the brain's NMDA receptor system looked like under extended or high-dose conditions, or whether the chemical structure that made it effective for coughs also happened to make it interesting for a teenager with curiosity and no particular plans for a Friday night. Regulatory approvals are only as good as the questions they ask. In 1958, nobody was asking those questions. After approval, DXM was incorporated into a growing number of cough and cold products, and it settled into the comfortable anonymity of the medicine aisle. It became one of those ingredients that is everywhere and noticed by nobody, like sodium benzoate or xanthan gum, a functional component of a product that does its job quietly and inspires no particular curiosity. Pharmacists knew what it was. Physicians knew what it was. The general public knew it as the stuff in cough syrup and thought about it roughly as often as they thought about the active ingredient in their shampoo. And then, slowly, the compound began attracting a different kind of attention. Not from researchers, not from regulators, from people who were paying attention to what happened when the dose went wrong, or from a certain perspective when the dose went very interestingly right. The first documented cases of DXM abuse began appearing in the medical literature in the 1960s, clustering around a specific product called Romila, a pure DXM tablet that had been marketed for exactly the cough-suppressing purpose for which it was approved. Someone had taken too many, then someone else had. Then a pattern emerged. The lab that thought it had accidentally solved the cough suppressant problem had, it turned out, accidentally made something else entirely. What that something else was would take another 4 decades to fully understand. Here is a crucial and frequently overlooked historical footnote. DXM abuse was not invented by the internet. Long before Reddit, long before message boards, long before anyone thought to Google how to get high on cold medicine, American teenagers in the 1970s were already experimenting with it, specifically with a product called Romila, which was a pure DXM tablet that contained none of the other ingredients found in cough syrups. Romila was aggressively and enthusiastically abused by the American youth of its era, so much so that the manufacturer voluntarily pulled it from the market in 1973, apparently hoping that if they made DXM slightly harder to isolate, the problem would go away. And it did, for a while. What nobody anticipated was that removing the convenient tablet form would not eliminate the desire, only redirect it. Teenagers would simply move on to the syrup. They were nothing if not adaptable. Think about the 1970s for a moment. Pharmacologically speaking, this is not a decade of restraint. The cultural backdrop against which DXM abuse first emerged is a period in which drug experimentation is so broadly normalized across American youth culture that a teenager drinking cough syrup to get high is, relatively speaking, not even the strangest thing happening that weekend. LSD is around, Quaaludes are around, PCP is around. The pharmaceutical landscape of recreational drug use in the 1970s makes DXM look almost quaint by comparison. A mild, over-the-counter dissociative in a bottle with a child-proof cap, consumed by teenagers who probably would have preferred something more exotic but were working with what was available. The Romila situation is notable because it represents the first time the pharmaceutical industry was confronted directly with the abuse potential of DXM, and the response, voluntary market withdrawal, established a template that would be repeated, with variations, for the next several decades. The logic is understandable. If people are abusing this specific form of the product, remove the specific form. The limitation of the logic is that it addresses the vehicle without addressing the compound, and the compound remains in 100 other products on the same shelf. Romila disappears, Robitussin stays, the teenagers notice. Through the late 70s and into the 80s, DXM abuse persists at a low simmer, present enough to generate occasional medical case reports and pharmacy industry discussions, not dramatic enough to generate major public health responses. The information about how to abuse DXM travels through word of mouth, through the informal networks of teenage social life, through the specific type of whispered knowledge that passes between people who have discovered something their parents don't know about. It is, by the standards of what is coming, a small and contained phenomenon. But the containment is entirely dependent on the friction of information transfer, getting the word from one teenager to another, across social groups, across geographies, across generations of high school students, takes time. The information spreads slowly because the only mechanism for spreading it is human conversation. Then the internet arrives, and the friction disappears, and what was a slow simmer becomes, within a decade, a boil. But that part comes later. In the 1970s, the first wave of DXM abuse rolls through American youth culture, crests and retreats, leaving behind a withdrawal of one specific product, a handful of medical case reports, and a compound that is still in the cough syrup waiting. The internet, when it arrived, did not invent DXM abuse. What it did was document it, systematize it, and distribute that system to every teenager with a dial-up connection and a sense of curiosity. By the late 1990s, there were detailed guides online explaining not just that you could get high on cough syrup, but exactly how and in what quantities and what to expect at each stage. The community that developed around DXM use introduced what they called plateaus, 4 distinct stages of intoxication corresponding to increasing doses. The first plateau, roughly 100 to 200 milligrams, produces mild euphoria and a slightly swimmy feeling that users compared to being pleasantly drunk. The second plateau adds more pronounced dissociation and visual distortion. The third plateau is where things get genuinely strange, out-of-body experiences, loss of time, inability to speak coherently. And the fourth plateau, which required truly alarming quantities of syrup, produced what users described as a complete break from ordinary consciousness. They compared it to a near-death experience. That is not a metaphor that typically appears on a cough suppressant label. Let's sit with each of these plateaus for a moment, because the specificity is important. The first plateau, mild, almost pleasant, easily confused for other things, is where most casual or curious first-time users end up. You've taken somewhere between 1 and 2 standard doses of DXM. Your cough is very thoroughly suppressed. You feel warm, slightly disconnected, a little giddy. Nothing about this experience would cause you to seek emergency medical attention. Nothing about this experience would even necessarily alarm a parent who happened to walk by. You seem a little off, maybe, a little quiet. You probably just have that cold you've been fighting. The first plateau is deceptively manageable, and it is almost certainly where many teenagers stopped. Took too much cough syrup once, felt weird, decided it wasn't worth repeating. Not everyone climbs higher, but some do. The second plateau is where the experience becomes distinctly unusual. The dissociation is now pronounced enough that you're aware of it, aware that the room feels slightly wrong, that your body seems to be operating at a small distance from your perception of it, that music sounds different in a way that's difficult to describe but easy to notice. Visual disturbances appear. Colours seem saturated, edges seem slightly unstable. Peripheral vision behaves in ways that peripheral vision is not supposed to behave. You can still hold a conversation technically, but it requires effort. You are without question not sober. If someone walks into the room, they will know something is happening. The second plateau is where DXM stops being something you could explain away and starts being something you'd need a story for. The third plateau is alarming by almost any measure. At this level of intoxication, the connection between your sense of self and your physical body becomes genuinely tenuous. Users reported feeling as though they were observing themselves from a distance, as though their consciousness had relocated to somewhere slightly above and behind their actual body. Time becomes largely meaningless. Conversations are at best fragmentary. Movement is difficult and poorly coordinated. You're in a state that a physician would describe as severely altered, and that a toxicologist would describe as consistent with high-dose NMDA receptor antagonism, and that a teenager on a forum in 2002 would describe as peaking pretty hard. The fourth plateau, which required quantities of DXM that no reasonable person could consume comfortably, was described by those who reached it in terms usually reserved for mystical experience or medical emergency, often both simultaneously. Several people who got there did not get there intentionally. Several of them ended up in the hospital. The plateaus had a ceiling. Not everyone found it before they ran out of options. For a significant period in American retail history, CVS and similar pharmacy chains were, entirely without intending to be, the primary suppliers of a youth drug epidemic. The cough and cold aisle was open, well stocked, and staffed by people whose job was to sell pharmaceuticals, not investigate the purchasing habits of the 16-year-old buying 6 bottles of Robitussin maximum strength on a Tuesday afternoon. This was not malice. It was an infrastructure designed for sick people with coughs, now being quietly navigated by teenagers who had done their research and knew exactly which products contained pure DXM and which were cocktailed with other ingredients that made overconsumption actively dangerous. The ones with the acetaminophen were the problem, because acetaminophen, which is the active ingredient in Tylenol, is entirely safe at normal doses and catastrophically toxic to the liver at the quantities required for a DXM high. Teenagers who didn't read carefully were not just getting high, they were quietly destroying their own livers in the process. Picture the cough and cold aisle of a mid-sized American pharmacy in 2003. It is, by design, one of the most overwhelming retail environments in modern commerce. There are easily 50 to 80 products on those shelves, differentiated by colour, brand name, suffix, DM, CF, maximum strength, nighttime, PE, and organised by symptom in a system that is either brilliantly logical or completely impenetrable, depending on how you feel about small print labels and product grid mapping. A person with a cold, head throbbing, trying to find the right thing, will often just grab whatever looks familiar and move on. A teenager who has done 2 weeks of forum research knows exactly which product on that shelf has the highest DXM concentration with the fewest additional active ingredients, and they will find it in approximately 4 seconds. This is not a hypothetical. The DXM-using community maintained lists, specific product recommendations circulated through forums with the detail of a restaurant menu, this brand, this formulation, this size, available at this type of store, generally located in this section of the aisle. The knowledge infrastructure was comprehensive. The retail infrastructure was entirely unprepared for it. Cashiers were not trained to flag multiple bottle purchases of cough syrup. There was no system for tracking how often a specific customer returned for the same product. The pharmacy model was built on the assumption that medicine is purchased by people who need it, and that assumption was correct for the vast majority of customers. The small minority who were purchasing with other intentions moved through the same system invisibly, purchased their 6 bottles, and were gone. The association between CVS specifically and the DXM epidemic is partly fair, and partly the product of CVS's market share. As one of the largest pharmacy chains in the country, it was simply present in more locations where the epidemic was occurring. But CVS did eventually take meaningful action, and it did so before federal regulation required it. In 2007, the chain announced age restrictions on DXM purchases, a policy that cost them a small amount of convenience-driven sales and generated a large amount of goodwill with public health advocates who have been pushing for exactly this kind of voluntary measure for years. The cough and cold aisle remained. The Robitussin remained. But the 16-year-old now needed to show ED, which was not nothing, and was in fact more than most states were legally requiring at that point. The Internet's role in the DXM epidemic is genuinely one of the stranger chapters in the history of drug culture, because it represents one of the first times that the free and open exchange of information on the web produced a clearly measurable public health harm, and nobody knew what to do about it. Forums like Erowid, which positioned itself as a harm reduction resource, contained extraordinarily detailed information about DXM, dosing guides, trip reports, warnings about dangerous combinations, and entire community threads dedicated to comparing experiences at different plateaus. The stated intention was to keep people safe. The actual effect was to make a fringe behaviour much more accessible to a much larger audience. When something is terrifying and poorly documented, it stays niche. When something is terrifying but thoroughly documented by people who survived it and want to share the experience, it becomes a subculture, and then, if the conditions are right, a trend. Consider the information landscape available to a curious 15-year-old in, say, 1998, versus the same curious 15-year-old in 2002. In 98, this teenager might have heard from a friend of a friend that you could get high on cough syrup. The rumour is vague. There are no details. How much do you take? What does it feel like? What happens if something goes wrong? Nobody knows. The information barrier is high enough that most teenagers who hear the rumour don't act on it, because the unknowns are too numerous and too frightening. By 2002, that same teenager can spend 40 minutes on the internet and come away with a comprehensively documented guide to every aspect of the DXM experience. Dosing by body weight, product selection, safety precautions, what to expect at each stage, what combinations to avoid, and dozens of first-person accounts written by people who had done it and survived to type about it. The information barrier has effectively disappeared. What used to require word-of-mouth transmission across months now requires a search engine and an afternoon. Erowid deserves specific mention because it occupies a genuinely complicated moral position in this history. The site was founded in the mid-90s with a sincere commitment to drug harm reduction, the belief that people are going to use substances whether or not information is available, and that making accurate information available reduces the damage those substances cause. This is not an unreasonable philosophical position. It has legitimate support in public health research. The problem, in the specific case of DXM, is that the harm reduction framing assumed a population of adults making informed choices, and the actual population consuming the information was disproportionately teenagers for whom the primary harm was not choosing the wrong product but choosing to use the substance at all. Information that reduced the risk of liver failure from combination products also reduced the barrier to first use by making the entire enterprise seem manageable, documented, and survivable. Both of these things were true simultaneously. Nobody on the internet could figure out what to do about that. Other forums, less carefully moderated than Erowid, were less ambivalent. Message boards dedicated to DXM use were enthusiastic and uncomplicated in their promotion of the activity. Trip reports were shared, celebrated, compared. Users developed reputations as experienced guides to the plateau system. The community had its own etiquette, its own inside references, its own sense of shared identity. It was, in the structure of its social dynamics, indistinguishable from any other hobbyist community on the early internet. The hobby, of course, involved consuming large quantities of a dissociative anesthetic derived from cough medicine, but the community itself functioned like any other. It had regulars. It had newcomers asking basic questions. It had old hands giving patient, detailed answers. It was, by the standards of early internet forums, quite friendly. That was part of the problem. One of the defining features of the DXM epidemic, particularly in its peak years of roughly 2000 to 2010, was how thoroughly invisible it was to parents. Not because the parents were negligent, but because the nature of the drug made it uniquely difficult to detect. It was legal. It was over the counter. It smelled like medicine because it was medicine. A teenager whose bedroom contained a bottle of Robitussin was, to most parents, a teenager who had a cough. Empty bottles were easily disposed of. The symptoms of DXM intoxication, disorientation, slurred speech, glassy eyes, strange behaviour could be mistaken for a dozen other things. There was no telltale smell of alcohol, no paraphernalia, no obvious signs. The first sign many parents received that something was wrong was a phone call from a school nurse, an emergency room, or in the worst cases, a police officer. And even then, the parents often could not process the information because the idea that their child had been getting high on cold medicines simply did not compute. Think about what a parent in 2004 is actually looking for when they're trying to assess whether their teenager is using drugs. They're looking for the things they were told to look for, the things their own parents looked for, the things the DARE program mentioned, the things that appear in parenting books published in the 90s. Red eyes that smell like marijuana, constricted pupils and unusual drowsiness that might indicate opiates, the jittery energy and rapid speech associated with stimulants. These are the signs the cultural infrastructure of parental vigilance has been built to recognize. A teenager who comes home quiet, a little uncoordinated, speaking slowly, and says they don't feel well because they have a cold, that teenager is describing symptoms that are literally identical to the intended effects of the medicine they theoretically took. There is no template in the parental detection playbook for this. The playbook was not written with DXM in mind. The medicine cabinet itself was part of the camouflage. In most American households in the early 2000s, the family medicine cabinet contains DXM products. This is not unusual. This is normal. A bottle of NyQuil, a bottle of Robitussin, some Dayquil. These are household staples in the way that aspirin and bandages are household staples. A teenager helping themselves to the medicine cabinet is, on the surface, a teenager taking medicine, which is a behaviour parents generally encourage. The leap required to connect teenager took cough syrup to teenager is attempting to achieve a dissociative hallucinogenic experience is not a leap that most parents in this era were positioned to make. You would have to already know about DXM abuse to look for it. Most parents didn't know about it, and the community of teenagers who did was not, generally speaking, in the habit of informing their parents. What broke the invisibility, in most cases, was an overdose, a trip to the emergency room, a school incident visible enough that the school had to call home, a friend who got scared enough to tell an adult. The revelation, when it came, was almost always retrospective, parents learning, in the aftermath of a crisis, that something had been happening in their household for months or years that they had completely missed. The medicine was right there the whole time, in the cabinet, on the shelf, perfectly legal, perfectly familiar. They had bought it themselves. This was perhaps the most disorienting part of the revelation. Not that their teenager had done something dangerous, but that the dangerous thing had been sitting in their own bathroom. If there is an unsung group of heroes in the DXM epidemic, it is school nurses, a profession that is simultaneously undervalued, underpaid, and apparently expected to identify symptoms of every possible substance of abuse in children who are also crying, faking fevers, and asking for Tylenol for reasons that are not always what they claim. School nurses began noticing a pattern in the early 2000s. Kids coming in with dilated pupils, extreme confusion, an inability to walk straight, and a distinctive smell that took some time to identify because it smelled essentially like medicine. The behaviour was strange enough to be alarming but familiar enough to be confusing. These kids didn't look like they'd been drinking, and they denied taking anything. It took cross-referencing with counsellors, administrators, and eventually poison control centres before a clear picture began to form. And once it did, the first instinct of many schools was not to publicise it, because the fear was that publicising it would spread it. That fear was, in many cases, correct. The school nurse's office in the early 2000s is a specific kind of institution. It smells like adhesive bandages and antiseptic. There is usually one cot, a poster about hand washing, and a chair for students waiting to see if their headache is real or an elaborate performance designed to avoid a math test. The school nurse has seen everything. Sprained ankles, actual emergencies, kids trying to get out of PE, kids who genuinely need help, kids who are lying, and kids who are lying about lying. The school nurses, in the hierarchy of institutional childhood healthcare, the front line, the first trained adult to encounter a student who is presenting with symptoms that don't belong in a school building. When DXM cases started arriving in school nurses' offices, they arrived with a particular strangeness. The student isn't dramatically ill in any obvious way. They're not unconscious. They're not having a seizure. They're just wrong, unsteady in a way that doesn't quite resemble alcohol, confused in a way that doesn't match a fever. Their eyes are doing something unusual. Their speech is slightly off in a way that's hard to specify but easy to notice. They say they don't know what's happening. Sometimes they genuinely don't. They thought they took the right amount, or they knew exactly what they were doing and are now regretting the dose. The challenge for the school nurse is that standard training for recognizing substance abuse doesn't include a DXM-specific module, because until someone is in the middle of an epidemic of DXM abuse in teenagers, it doesn't occur to anyone to create one. The nurse is working from general principles. Something is wrong with this child. The symptoms suggest possible intoxication. Standard drug screening will probably not catch whatever this is, and the emergency response protocol needs to be activated. They call parents. They call emergency services when necessary. They document everything. They compare notes with other nurses in the district. Slowly, through exactly this kind of frontline pattern recognition, a picture forms. The school nurses, quietly and systematically, were among the first to see the full shape of what was happening. They were also among the least listened to when they tried to report it upward. Numbers tell stories that anecdotes cannot, and the story that DXM was telling through poison control data in the early 2000s was not a subtle one. Calls to poison control centres related to DXM abuse began climbing in the late 1990s and accelerated sharply through the 2000s, particularly among adolescents between the ages of 12 and 17. The American Association of Poison Control Centers began flagging it as a trend. The FDA received adverse event reports. Emergency rooms in suburban communities, the places nobody was looking for a drug crisis, started seeing teenagers brought in by friends who were frightened and unsure what their companion had taken. The consistent thread across all of these data points was age. This was a youth phenomenon concentrated in middle school and high school populations, in communities that did not consider themselves at risk for drug abuse, because the drug in question was sold between the antacids and the vitamin C supplements. Poison control centers are, in the landscape of American public health infrastructure, one of the most quietly essential institutions in existence. They are staffed around the clock by toxicologists and trained specialists whose job is to answer the phone when someone has taken something they shouldn't have, in a quantity they shouldn't have taken it in, and needs to know immediately what to do about it. The calls come from parents who found an open container, from emergency nurses who need to know the lethal dose of a specific compound, from frightened teenagers calling on behalf of friends who aren't making sense, from adults who grabbed the wrong bottle in the dark. Poison control centers receive every variety of accidental and intentional toxicological emergency that the human capacity for poor decision-making can generate, which is a wide and creative range. When DXM calls began increasing, the poison control system noticed before almost anyone else, because poison control centers aggregate data in real time in a way that most other healthcare institutions do not. A single emergency room sees its own cases. A poison control center sees patterns across an entire region, the same active ingredient appearing in calls from multiple counties in the same age bracket with the same presentation. By the early 2000s, the pattern was unmistakable to anyone looking at the data. DXM calls were rising. The callers were young. The exposures were intentional. The trend was accelerating. The challenge was translating the data into policy response at a speed that matched the acceleration of the trend. Public health. Institutions are, by nature and necessity, careful. They want to confirm patterns before acting on them, to ensure that what looks like a trend is actually a trend and not a statistical artifact. By the time the confirmation process completed, the trend had continued developing. The data from 2002 looked alarming. The data from 2005 looked significantly worse. The calls that poison control centres were receiving by the mid-2000s were describing cases more serious than those from the beginning of the decade, higher doses, younger patients, more severe presentations. The story the numbers were telling had gone from concerning to urgent, and the institutional machinery for responding to urgent was only beginning to engage. Here is where the DXM epidemic becomes not just strange, but genuinely medically alarming, in a way that goes beyond the expected risks of any drug misuse. The vast majority of DXM-containing products on the market did not contain DXM alone. They were combination products formulated with other active ingredients to address the full range of cold and flu symptoms, decongestants, antihistamines, and very commonly, acetaminophen. Acetaminophen is one of the safest pain relievers in the world at recommended doses. At doses several times the recommended maximum, it causes acute liver failure, not slowly, not eventually, acutely. A teenager attempting to reach the third or fourth DXM plateau by drinking multiple bottles of a combination product was consuming quantities of acetaminophen that could cause irreversible liver damage before any obvious symptoms appeared, and the DXM high masked any warning signs. Emergency physicians treating DXM cases began discovering through blood work that a terrifying proportion of these patients were simultaneously experiencing acetaminophen toxicity that the patients themselves had no idea about. Acetaminophen toxicity is particularly cruel in its timeline. The initial overdose produces no dramatic symptoms, no immediate pain, no obvious distress, no visible sign that anything has gone catastrophically wrong. The toxicity is happening in the liver at the cellular level, quietly and efficiently. The symptoms of liver failure that eventually appear, nausea, abdominal pain, jaundice, don't typically emerge for 24 to 72 hours after the exposure. By the time a patient who consumed a large quantity of acetaminophen begins feeling sick in the way that liver failure makes you sick, the window for the most effective treatment may have already closed. This is why acetaminophen overdose is one of the leading causes of acute liver failure in the developed world, not because the drug is particularly dangerous at therapeutic doses, but because the consequences of overdose are delayed enough that people don't realize what's happened until it has already happened. Now layer the DXM high on top of this, a teenager in the third plateau of DXM. Intoxication is not in a state where they are carefully monitoring their symptoms for early signs of hepatotoxicity. They are barely in a state where they can identify the room they're in. The dissociative effect of DXM at high doses is profound enough that even moderately serious physical symptoms can be missed or misinterpreted. The nausea that might signal acetaminophen toxicity is also a common side effect of high-dose DXM itself. The disorientation that might prompt concern gets blended into the dissociative experience. By the time the teenager comes down from the DXM, the acetaminophen toxicity may be well established, and the window for the most effective antidote, N-acetylcysteine, which works best in the early hours after exposure, may be significantly narrowed. Emergency physicians who treated DXM cases in the early 2000s describe a consistent and alarming pattern. Patient presence with DXM intoxication, blood work returns showing elevated liver enzymes. Patient has no idea their liver is in trouble. Treatment for the DXM intoxication is initiated. treatment for the acetaminophen toxicity runs simultaneously. The two problems require different interventions. The patient, who thought they were taking something they read about online and managing the risks responsibly, is managing two medical emergencies at once. The online guides that carefully enumerated the dangers of DXM, the interactions to avoid, the doses to calculate carefully, had not always communicated the acetaminophen risk with equal clarity. The liver damage was the invisible danger hiding inside the high. Within the DXM community online, a kind of harm reduction culture developed that is, in retrospect, one of the stranger footnotes of the era, because it was a community of teenagers on the internet earnestly trying to make recreational cough syrup abuse safer. The central message was simple: only use products containing DXM as the sole active ingredient. Avoid combination products with acetaminophen, guaifenesin or pseudoephedrine at all costs. Read the label, calculate your dose by body weight. Do not mix with alcohol, antidepressants or other substances. Have a sober person present. This advice was medically sound in the narrow sense that following it would indeed reduce certain specific risks. It was also, in the broader sense, advice on how to be a responsible recreational user of a dissociative hallucinogen that was not designed to be used recreationally, distributed freely on the public internet to any teenager who searched for it. The harm reduction community genuinely believed they were helping. The pharmaceutical industry, the FDA, and most parents would have disagreed. The internal logic of the DXM harm reduction community is worth examining without condescension, because it is actually coherent within its own frame. The community had correctly identified that the most dangerous DXM products were combination formulations. It had correctly identified that the acetaminophen risk was real and poorly communicated. It had correctly identified that certain drug interactions, particularly with monoamine oxidase inhibitors, a class of antidepressants, could produce a potentially fatal condition called serotonin syndrome. It had developed, through collective experience and sharing of medical literature, a reasonably accurate picture of the pharmacological risks associated with high-dose DXM. The information it produced was, in its factual content, largely accurate. The context in which it was being applied was the problem. Harm reduction as a public health philosophy is well supported by evidence when applied to adults who have made the decision to use a substance and cannot be effectively deterred from that use. The logic is straightforward. If someone is going to use a drug regardless, providing them with accurate information about how to do so more safely reduces net harm. The counter-argument, particularly relevant for adolescent populations, is that reducing the perceived danger of a behavior also reduces a key deterrent against that behavior. If the online guides make DXM abuse sound manageable, documented and survivable, and if they answer all the frightening questions a first-time user might have, then some portion of teenagers who would have been deterred by uncertainty will instead proceed. The harm reduction calculus changes when the population in question includes people who have not yet started. The community could not resolve this tension, and arguably could not be expected to. It was made up of people who had already decided to use DXM and wanted to do so with less risk. The question of whether their documentation was simultaneously reducing risk for existing users and lowering barriers for new ones was not one that a forum of teenagers was equipped to answer definitively. They did what they thought was responsible. Whether it was, or net beneficial, is a question that does not have a clean answer. If there is one product name that haunts the DXM epidemic more than any other, it is Coricidin HBP cough and cold, a bright red tablet manufactured for people with high blood pressure who could not take standard decongestants. Coricidin became notorious in the early 2000s not because it was the most effective DXM product, but because it was the most convenient one. Tablets rather than syrup. Easy to pocket, easy to hide, easy to take in large quantities without having to choke down 8 ounces of thick cherry-flavoured liquid. The problem, the serious, occasionally fatal problem, is that Coricidin contains chlorpheniramine, an antihistamine, in quantities that are genuinely toxic at the doses required for a DXM high. Chlorpheniramine overdose causes heart arrhythmias, seizures, and death. Teenagers who chose Coricidin because it was discreet and pill-shaped were unknowingly choosing one of the most dangerous DXM-containing products on the market. Emergency. Physicians gave it a nickname that has since entered medical literature, Triple C, for CCC, the letters stamped on the tablet. The cases involving Triple C were among the most serious and the most tragic. There is a specific and terrible irony at the centre of the Coricidin story. The product was designed for people with high blood pressure precisely because it was formulated without pseudoephedrine, the decongestant found in standard cold medicines that can elevate blood pressure and cause cardiac complications in vulnerable patients. Coricidin was, in other words, a safer version of standard cold medicine for a specific population with specific cardiovascular concerns. The safety consideration built into its design was the absence of one potentially dangerous ingredient. The presence of chlorpheniramine in quantities that became toxic at recreational doses was simply not a design consideration, because no one designing a cold medicine for hypertensive patients was thinking about what would happen if a teenager took 20 of them. The tablet format was the fatal attraction. Drinking large quantities of cough syrup is an inherently unpleasant experience. The sweetness becomes nauseating. The texture is difficult. The volume required for higher plateaus creates its own deterrence. Tablets require none of this. You take them the same way you take any pill. There's no overwhelming flavour, no volume to manage, no visible evidence of what you're consuming. A teenager with a handful of Coricidin tablets in their pocket looks like a teenager with a handful of cough medicine tablets in their pocket, which is unremarkable and invisible. The barrier to consumption was dramatically lower than with syrup products, and the chlorpheniramine dosage climbed with every tablet silently toward thresholds that could stop a heart. Emergency rooms that saw Triple C cases described a presentation notably more alarming than standard DXM cases. The addition of chlorpheniramine toxicity on top of DXM intoxication created a clinical picture that was more unpredictable, more difficult to manage, and more frequently fatal. Seizures, cardiac arrhythmias, respiratory depression. The DXM plateau experience that the online community had documented and normalized was not the experience these patients were having. They were having a different experience, one that the guides had not adequately prepared them for, because the guides had not adequately accounted for what chlorpheniramine does at 10 times the recommended dose. The bright red tablet had seemed like the convenient option. It was the most dangerous one. Government agencies do not move quickly, which is not an insult, it is a structural reality of how large organizations process information and translate it into policy. The FDA began receiving clear signals about the DXM problem in the early 2000s, and its response was measured, methodical, and arrived several years after the problem had already peaked. The agency held advisory meetings, requested data, reviewed adverse event reports, and eventually concluded that yes, DXM abuse among adolescents was a significant public health concern. What they did not do, and what they arguably could not do without congressional action, was remove DXM from the over-the-counter market entirely. DXM genuinely works as a cough suppressant. Millions of Americans use it appropriately every year. The regulatory challenge was not identifying the problem, but finding a solution that addressed the harm without eliminating the legitimate therapeutic use. And that is a harder problem than it sounds, especially when the substance in question is embedded in hundreds of different products from dozens of different manufacturers. The FDA's regulatory authority over over-the-counter drugs operates through a framework called the OTC Drug Review, a process established in the 1970s to evaluate the safety and efficacy of active ingredients used in non-prescription products. Under this framework, ingredients like DXM are assigned a category. Category 1 means safe and effective, Category 2 means not safe or not effective, Category 3 means insufficient data to make a determination. DXM had been comfortably in Category 1 since the review's inception. Reclassifying it would require generating and evaluating new evidence, a process measured in years, not months, and would need to be balanced against the legitimate therapeutic value that millions of users derived from the compound annually. This is the regulatory bind that defined the FDA's response to DXM abuse. The same evidence standard that protects the public from unsafe drugs also slows the response to emerging harms. By the time the FDA could formally reclassify DXM based on evidence of abuse potential, the worst years of the epidemic had already occurred. The agency moved toward an advisory process instead, issuing guidance on product labeling, working with manufacturers on reformulation options and supporting the voluntary retail age restriction programs that chains like CVS were beginning to implement. Advisory and voluntary measures move faster than formal regulatory reclassification. They also rely on the willingness of industry to comply, which is a variable that not all industry participants weighted equally. The FDA's measured pace was a source of genuine frustration for public health advocates and parents groups who felt that the agency was watching an identifiable crisis unfold and choosing caution over urgency. The FDA's position was that its regulatory tools were designed for precision, not speed, and that blunt interventions, removing DXM from the market for instance, would cause harms of their own by eliminating a legitimate and widely used therapeutic option. Both positions were defensible. Neither position felt adequate to the parents who were receiving phone calls from emergency rooms. Let us be precise about the pharmaceutical industry's response to the DXM epidemic, because precision matters here. Several manufacturers did take meaningful steps, reformulating products, reducing concentrations of DXM, adding bittering agents to make large quantities more difficult to consume, and working with retailers on behind-the-counter placement policies. Other manufacturers did the absolute minimum required by regulators and market pressure, which is a sentence that will surprise approximately nobody who's ever observed a large corporation responding to a public health concern that does not directly threaten their core revenue. The bittering agents added to some formulations were a particularly interesting compromise. A compound called denatonium, which is one of the most intensely bitter substances known to chemistry, was added to certain Robitussin products in concentrations designed to make drinking large quantities nearly impossible due to the taste. It was not quite the same as solving the underlying problem, but it was something. Denatonium is worth a brief digression because it is, in the specific context of this epidemic, one of the more creative harm reduction solutions ever deployed by a pharmaceutical company, and also one of the more revealing ones. Denatonium is so intensely bitter that it is detectable by humans at concentrations of parts per billion. It is used as an aversive agent in products ranging from nail-biting deterrents to antifreeze, specifically because its bitterness is so overwhelming that the mere presence of trace amounts makes the host substance essentially undrinkable. Adding denatonium to Robitussin did not change the pharmacological properties of DXM one bit. It did not remove DXM from the product. It did not restrict access to the product. It simply made consuming large quantities of the product so violently unpleasant, from a taste perspective, that the practical barrier to recreational use was significantly elevated. It was pharmaceutical engineering applied to a behavioral problem. The message decoded is, we're not going to remove the active ingredient that is being abused. We're going to make abusing it disgusting. The response from manufacturers who did not add denatonium or otherwise reformulate their products was, essentially, to wait. Wait for regulation to require action. Wait for competitors to move first and absorb any market consequences. Wait for the epidemic to peak and recede, as drug epidemics typically do. This is not a flattering characterization, but it is an accurate one. The market incentive structure for pharmaceutical companies in the DXM epidemic pointed toward inaction. DXM products were profitable. Any reformulation involved cost and risk, and there was no direct legal liability for the intended use of a product, causing harm in unintended use scenarios. The companies that did take proactive steps did so because of genuine corporate responsibility commitments, reputational concerns, or leadership decisions that prioritized long-term goodwill over short-term margin protection. They deserve credit for it. The ones who waited deserve to be remembered for waiting. Before federal regulation caught up to the DXM problem, the retail industry took a notable and largely self-motivated step. Age restrictions. CVS, the chain most associated with the epidemic in public perception, announced in 2007 that it would require proof of age for the purchase of DXM-containing products, setting the threshold at 18 years old. This was not legally required. It was a voluntary policy, adopted in response to public pressure, media coverage, and the increasingly uncomfortable position of being identified as the primary point of purchase for a youth drug trend. Other major pharmacy chains followed. Products were moved behind counters in many locations, or secured in locked cases that required staff assistance to access. The effect of these measures was real but imperfect. Age restrictions slow access, they don't eliminate it, and the internet's ability to connect teenagers with information about alternative sources remained undiminished. But it was, at minimum, friction, and friction, in public health, saves lives. The behind-the-counter placement strategy is worth examining in detail because it represents a retail-driven innovation in drug access control that had no clear precedent for over-the-counter products. The model was borrowed from the pseudoephedrine restrictions that had been implemented earlier in the decade. Federal legislation required pseudoephedrine, a decongestant used in methamphetamine production, to be moved behind the pharmacy counter and purchased in limited quantities with identification. The pseudoephedrine intervention was a response to a different drug problem, but the mechanism, restricting access to a legal over-the-counter product by requiring interaction with a pharmacist or staff member, translated reasonably well to DXM. The interaction with staff created a social accountability that open-shelf placement did not. A teenager picking up a product from a shelf can do so invisibly. A teenager asking a pharmacist to retrieve 6 bottles of Robitussin from behind the counter faces a different kind of social calculation. How effective were the retail interventions? The honest answer is, partially and measurably. Poison control data in the years following the implementation of age restrictions and behind-the-counter policy shows a reduction in DXM abuse cases among the youngest adolescent cohorts, the 12 to 15 age bracket, that correlates temporally with the rollout of these policies. Older teenagers, who could present convincing identification or enlist 18-year-old friends as proxies, were less affected. Online purchasing of pure DXM powder, which had begun emerging as an alternative source, was not affected at all. The retail interventions worked on the margins that were easiest to affect and were less effective against the more determined end of the user population. This is historically a consistent pattern in drug access restriction. The interventions reduce casual use at the accessible end of the distribution without meaningfully affecting committed users who have the motivation to work around them. It was worth doing. It was not sufficient by itself, because the United States government operates through a combination of federal and state authority that is not always elegantly coordinated. The legislative response to DXM abuse unfolded differently across different states, at different speeds, with different specifics. California was among the first states to pass a law restricting DXM sales to those 18 and older in 2010. Other states followed with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some states restricted sales entirely below 18. Some required identification. Some focused specifically on pure DXM products rather than combination medicines. The result was a complicated and inconsistent national landscape in which the legality and accessibility of purchasing large quantities of cough medicine for recreational purposes depended significantly on which state you happened to be standing in when you walked into a pharmacy. This is a sentence that should be more surprising than it is. State legislative processes in the area of drug policy follow a pattern that is almost geological in its predictability. A problem emerges. Parents' advocacy groups form. They attend hearings and provide testimony. A sympathetic legislator introduces a bill. The bill is reviewed by committee. Pharmaceutical industry lobbyists appear to argue that the legislation is either unnecessary, unworkable, or counterproductive to legitimate public health goals. Consumer groups argue that access to cold medicine is a right that should not be restricted because of the behavior of a small minority of misusers. The legislative process grinds forward at its own pace, which is several years behind the public health emergency that prompted it. By the time California's law passed in 2010, the peak of the DXM epidemic was already behind it. The law was still worth passing. It was just not as timely as it could have been if the legislative machinery had moved at the speed of the problem rather than the speed of consensus. The inconsistency of state-by-state legislation created its own complications. In states that passed age restrictions, retail compliance was generally good but not universal. Smaller stores, convenience stores, and gas stations were less consistently compliant than major pharmacy chains, and enforcement was largely reactive rather than proactive. In states without restrictions, the situation remained as it had been throughout the epidemic: open shelves, no age requirement, no limit on quantity. The geography of regulation meant that a teenager in a restricted state who was sufficiently motivated could drive to a neighbouring state or order online. The friction was real. The workarounds were also real, and the online marketplace for pure DXM powder, which required no retail interaction and crossed state lines through the mail, operated in a space that state legislation could not reach. By the mid-2000s, DXM abuse had migrated off text-based forums and onto video platforms, first in the early days of internet video, and then in force when YouTube arrived and made it trivially easy to upload a shaky, badly lit video of yourself describing what it felt like to consume an entire bottle of Robitussin. These videos performed well, in the algorithmic sense, because they were unusual and because young people were curious. They were also, from a public health standpoint, a combination of warning and advertisement, because watching someone describe a DXM experience was both alarming and, for a certain percentage of viewers, deeply intriguing. Platform moderation in this era was minimal. Content policies around drug use were inconsistently applied. The video stayed up, accumulated views, and introduced the concept of recreational cough syrup use to audiences who had never heard of it. The internet had replaced the word-of-mouth transmission that had previously limited the spread of any given drug trend, and it had done so with remarkable efficiency. YouTube launched in 2005, and within its first year of operation it contained DXM-related content, trip reports, demonstrations, videos of teenagers clearly under the influence, filmed by friends who found the experience amusing enough to document. The content was not created with advertising intent. It was created because the early internet was full of people who filmed themselves doing things and uploaded the footage with no particular agenda other than sharing the experience. The DXM videos were not instructions, technically. They were testimonials. But the effect of a compelling testimonial is difficult to distinguish from the effect of an instruction. Watching someone describe a dissociative experience in vivid, positive terms, filmed in an ordinary suburban bedroom with an ordinary box of cough medicine on the nightstand, sends a message that no written guide could quite replicate. This is a real thing that real people do, and here is what it looks like, and the person telling you about it survived and seems to have found it interesting. The algorithm, such as it was in the early years of YouTube, did not discriminate between content that described drug experiences in alarming terms and content that described them in appealing terms. Both performed similarly. The subject matter was unusual enough to attract clicks regardless of the tone. A video with the title DXM almost sent me to the hospital, and a video with the title Best DXM Experience Ever would both surface to a teenager searching for information about robo-tripping. The warning and the advertisement occupied the same search results, and the teenager would watch both, and the net effect on their decision-making was difficult to predict and impossible to control from a platform perspective. Platform content moderation in the mid-2000s was, to put it charitably, underdeveloped. YouTube's community guidelines in its early years addressed obvious categories of prohibited content: violence, sexual material, content involving minors, but drug-related content occupied a genuinely ambiguous space. A video of someone describing getting high on cough medicine violated no law. The substance was legal. The activity, while dangerous, was not criminal. The decision of whether to remove it required a policy judgment that the platforms were not yet structured to make quickly or consistently. Some videos were removed, most stayed up. The inconsistency was itself a signal to users. If some content was being removed, the removal was not systematic, and any individual piece of content had better than even odds of remaining accessible. The videos stayed up, the algorithm found audiences for them, and the information spread. Behind all the tabloid language and all the community harm reduction guides and all the legislative back and forth, there is a straightforward and rather sobering piece of neuroscience. DXM at high doses is a dissociative hallucinogen that acts primarily on NMDA receptors in the brain, the same receptors targeted by ketamine and PCP. It disrupts the normal processing of sensory information, severs the connection between perception and reality, and at sufficient doses produces a state that researchers describe as complete ego dissolution. In a fully developed adult brain, the consequences of occasional exposure, while not trivial, are generally recoverable. In an adolescent brain that is still actively developing, particularly in regions governing impulse control, emotional regulation, and the capacity to assess risk, the consequences are considerably less predictable, and the data, suggesting that repeated dissociative exposure during adolescence may have lasting effects on cognitive development, is not comforting. This was not hypothetical. It is what the clinical literature suggests. It was not widely communicated to teenagers at the time. The human brain is not fully developed until the mid-20s, a fact that is deeply inconvenient for every teenager who has ever been told it, and simultaneously the most important piece of neuroscience relevant to adolescent drug use. The regions that complete their development last are the ones governing executive function. The prefrontal cortex, which handles planning, impulse control, the ability to consider long-term consequences, and the capacity to accurately assess risk. These are, notably, exactly the regions most relevant to the decision of whether to drink an entire bottle of cough medicine. The adolescent brain is not a small adult brain. It is a structurally different organ, still undergoing significant architectural changes, and it responds to chemical inputs differently than an adult brain, with greater sensitivity, with less predictability, and with greater potential for lasting alteration. NMDA receptors are not peripheral players in brain development. They are central to the process of synaptic plasticity, the mechanism by which experience modifies brain structure, strengthening some connections and weakening others in response to learning and environmental input. This is how brains develop. Disrupting NMDA receptor function during adolescence, at a stage when the brain is actively using this mechanism to complete its development, is not the same as disrupting it in a fully formed adult brain. The research on this question is ongoing and incomplete. DXM is not ketamine, and the specific consequences of recreational DXM use on adolescent brain development are not fully characterized. But the general principle that compounds which interfere with NMDA-dependent plasticity are more consequential in developing brains is well established. The teenagers who were robotripping in the early 2000s were conducting a neurological experiment on themselves, without knowing it, in an organ that was not finished being built. The consequences varied. Some users reported no lasting effects. Others described persistent problems with memory, concentration, and mood that they attributed to their DXM use, though the confounders in such self-reports are significant. Controlled studies on the long-term effects of adolescent DXM abuse are limited, for the obvious ethical reason that you cannot design a study that gives teenagers large quantities of dissociatives and then measures the damage. What exists is a body of case reports, retrospective self-reports, and extrapolation from research on related compounds. It is not a comforting body of literature, even at the level of statistical inference. The brain that was being exposed to high-dose NMDA antagonism during its formative years was not the brain that anyone, not the teenager, not their parents, not the pharmaceutical company that made the cough syrup had planned for this particular experiment. Emergency physicians in the early 2000s developed a grim familiarity with a very specific type of case. The suburban teenager, brought in by a panicking friend or a terrified parent, eyes glazed and dilated, unable to answer simple questions, body rigid or flopping with involuntary movements, blood pressure at a number that required immediate attention. The initial challenge in these cases was often identification. DXM does not appear on standard drug screens, which test for opioids, benzodiazepines, amphetamines, and cocaine, among others. A standard toxicology panel could come back clean on a teenager who was profoundly intoxicated. Physicians who had not encountered DXM cases before would be left ruling out every other possible cause, meningitis, seizure disorder, psychiatric episode, while the patient remained in an alarming and deteriorating condition. The ones who had seen it before recognized it immediately. That specific, strange combination of dissociation and agitation. That particular smell. That history of a teenager who'd just taken some cold medicine. The emergency department at 2 a.m. is not a calm environment under any circumstances. It operates on a triage logic that is constantly recalibrated as new patients arrive. The chest pain takes priority over the sprained ankle. The seizure takes priority over the chest pain, and so on, in an ongoing dynamic negotiation between severity, resources, and the unpredictable timing of emergencies. A teenager brought in with altered mental status and an unknown substance exposure goes into the queue at a level of urgency that depends on their vital signs, and DXM, at high doses, can do things to vital signs that suggest a level of emergency somewhat higher than took too much cough medicine implies. Heart, rate elevation, blood pressure changes, temperature dysregulation. The constellation of physical findings in a severe DXM case resembles, in some respects, a serotonin syndrome presentation, which is its own medical emergency and requires prompt management. The toxicology panel problem was real and recurrent. Standard urine drug screens test for a finite panel of substances, those most commonly associated with emergency presentations, those for which reliable testing methodologies exist, and those that regulatory and institutional standards have identified as priorities. DXM was not on the standard panel. It requires a specific test or specific clinical knowledge to identify. A physician who ordered a standard tox screen on a DXM patient and received a negative result had to work backward from the symptoms, altered mental status, dissociation, particular eye findings, the smell, to arrive at the correct diagnosis. This was achievable for emergency physicians who had seen DXM cases before. It was considerably more difficult for physicians in communities where DXM abuse had not yet been identified as a local pattern, who had no prior frame of reference for the presentation. The institutional response to this identification problem was, over time, exactly what institutional responses to diagnostic gaps tend to be. Case reports published in emergency medicine journals, patterns shared at conferences, clinical training updated to include DXM as a differential in altered adolescent presentations, and eventually specific testing options added to institutional protocols in areas where prevalence warranted it. This process took several years. In the meantime, emergency physicians were treating what they saw as best they could, making clinical decisions based on incomplete information and occasionally learning the diagnosis after the fact, when a recovering patient or their parents confirmed what they had consumed. The emergency medicine community learned about DXM the same way it learns about most new threats, from the patients who arrived before anyone had written the protocol. The DXM epidemic did not produce death tolls that competed with opioids for front-page space, which is part of why its history is less well known than it deserves to be. But it did produce deaths, real, documented, named deaths of real teenagers, many of them entirely preventable, many of them involving the acetaminophen toxicity or cardiac complications that accompanied specific product choices. The cases that attracted media coverage tended to cluster: a teenager in Texas, a 14-year-old in Ohio, a group of high school students in Florida. Each case would produce a brief flurry of local news coverage, a concerned interview with a pharmacist or a toxicologist, and then quiet. The absence of a single dramatic, nationally visible incident meant that the epidemic never coalesced into the kind of media moment that drives rapid policy response. It was a crisis built of hundreds of smaller tragedies, each one devastating within its own community and largely invisible to everyone outside it. Public health emergencies in America attract national attention through a specific mechanism: a single case or cluster of cases that is dramatic enough, geographically proximate enough to major media markets, and narratively legible enough to sustain extended coverage. The opioid epidemic achieved this visibility because it was happening everywhere simultaneously, at a scale that could not be ignored, and because it had a clear villain in the form of pharmaceutical companies and prescribing physicians whose behaviour was documentable and condemnable. The DXM epidemic had none of these features. The harm was diffuse, scattered across suburban communities in numbers too small to dominate a news cycle individually. The villain, if the pharmaceutical industry can be called a villain for producing a legal effective medicine that some teenagers abused, was less cinematically obvious. The narrative was less clean. The coverage was local, brief, and unable to sustain momentum. The individual cases, though, were not abstractions. A 15-year-old in North Carolina who consumed a large quantity of Coricidin and did not survive. A 13-year-old in California whose acetaminophen toxicity was identified too late for the antidote to be maximally effective. A group of teenagers in a Midwestern suburb who were found by a parent, one of them requiring emergency transport, the others lucky enough to be treated and released. These cases had names attached to them in the local news coverage and in the testimony before state legislatures that the surviving parents subsequently gave. The names were real, the grief was real. The fact that the aggregate number was not large enough to move a federal needle does not retroactively make the individual tragedies smaller. It simply means that the policy machinery did not mobilize at the speed those specific tragedies warranted. The death toll question is also complicated by underreporting and misclassification. DXM does not appear on standard toxicology panels. Deaths in which diarsine was a contributing factor, but not the primary identified cause, may not have been coded as DXM related in death records. Acetaminophen liver failure resulting from a DXM binge might be recorded as acetaminophen overdose, without the DXM component being specifically flagged. The true number of deaths attributable to DXM abuse during the epidemic years is likely higher than the documented figures suggest, not dramatically higher, but meaningfully so. The documented cases are the floor of the toll, not the ceiling. In the wake of DXM-related deaths, some parents did what bereaved parents throughout history have done. They turned grief into action. Organizations formed, websites launched, testimony was given to legislative bodies, and school presentations were organized by mothers and fathers who had learned about DXM far too late and were determined that other parents would learn about it sooner. The advocacy community that emerged around DXM awareness occupies an interesting space in the history of American drug policy, because it was arguing for restrictions on a legal, approved, over-the-counter medicine, not a street drug, not a prescription drug, not a controlled substance. The argument was not that DXM was dangerous in the way methamphetamine is dangerous. It was that DXM was dangerous specifically to teenagers in specific quantities, and that the system was not doing enough to prevent those teenagers from accessing those quantities. The pharmaceutical industry listened to these advocates with varying degrees of sincerity. Bereaved parents have a particular kind of authority in the American policy conversation, an authority that derives not from expertise, but from moral weight. When a parent stands before a legislative committee and describes the death of their child in specific detail, it does something that data tables cannot do. It makes the abstract concrete. It makes the aggregate individual. It is harder to argue that a problem doesn't require urgent attention when the person making the counter-argument is someone whose teenager died from the problem 3 months ago. The DXM parent advocates understood this dynamic, and they used it skillfully, not cynically, but with the practical awareness that personal testimony moves legislators in ways that epidemiological data does not. The organizations that formed around DXM awareness, groups with names like the DXM Abuse Prevention Council and similar initiatives, developed educational materials, worked with school districts to add DXM to their substance abuse curricula, and lobbied both at the state and federal level for legislative action. They also pressured retailers directly, targeting pharmacy chains with letter-writing campaigns and media outreach that highlighted the connection between open shelf placement and youth access. CVS's 2007 age restriction policy was, by several accounts, significantly accelerated by organised pressure from parent advocacy groups who had been meeting with the company's public affairs team and making the conversation uncomfortable. The parents who showed up to those meetings were not there as lobbyists. They were there as people who had already received the phone call that these meetings were designed to help other parents avoid. The pharmaceutical industry's engagement with these advocates was, predictably, a mixed experience. Some manufacturers participated in good faith in conversations about reformulation and product placement. Others sent representatives to meetings who listened carefully, expressed sympathy, and then returned to their companies and continued doing exactly what they had been doing. The advocates became skilled at distinguishing between genuine engagement and performative concern, a skill that anyone who has dealt with large corporations on issues of public health eventually develops. They kept showing up regardless. The showing up was the point. Every drug culture develops its own language, and the DXM community was no exception. In fact, it was one of the more linguistically creative ones. perhaps because its membership skewed toward teenagers who spent a lot of time on the internet and had strong feelings about vocabulary. Robo-tripping was the most widely known term, derived from Robitussin, the brand most closely associated with the practice. Dexing was common. Skittling referred specifically to the use of Coricidin tablets, whose red colour resembled the candy. The plateaus were numbered and discussed with the seriousness of a grading system. Users described their experiences in elaborate trip reports, using the kind of dense clinical language that teenagers adopt when they want to sound like they have done their research, which, to be fair, many of them had. There were rating systems, favourite, products, recommendations based on body weight and experience level. It was, in structure, indistinguishable from any other enthusiast community on the early internet, which made it simultaneously fascinating and deeply unsettling. Language is one of the most reliable indicators that a behaviour has become a subculture rather than a collection of individual incidents. Shared vocabulary implies shared community, shared norms, and a shared identity that persists across time and geography. When teenagers in Florida were using the same terminology as teenagers in Washington state to describe the same behavioral sequence, it meant that a network existed, a distributed community connected through the internet and unified by a common experience and a common language. The language of DXM culture was specific enough to be meaningless to outsiders and precise enough to be informative to insiders, which is exactly the function that subculture language is supposed to serve. It was simultaneously a communication tool and a membership signal. The term robo-tripping deserves particular attention because it achieved something remarkable. It crossed from the subculture into mainstream media. By the mid-2000s, newspaper articles about DXM abuse were using the term, which meant it had escaped the forum ecosystem and entered general circulation. This is the moment when a drug trend typically receives its first sustained mainstream media coverage, when the language becomes legible to journalists. The coverage that followed the mainstreaming of robo-tripping was, as coverage of youth drug trends tends to be, somewhat hysterical in its framing. Teenagers were depicted as engaged in a dangerous, mysterious new practice, when in fact the practice had been occurring for years. The framing of novelty was useful for generating coverage, but not entirely accurate as a description of the phenomenon's timeline. The plateau numbering system was arguably the most consequential piece of DXM terminology, because it organized a potentially overwhelming amount of information into a simple, legible framework that made the experience seem more predictable than it actually was. Plateau 1, Plateau 2, Plateau 3, Plateau 4, each with associated doses, durations, and expected experiences. The framework gave users the sense that they understood what they were doing and could manage it systematically. This sense of understanding was not entirely false. The plateau system did correspond roughly to genuine pharmacological thresholds, but it was incomplete in ways that the simplicity of the terminology obscured. The plateaus were not clean steps. They were ranges with significant individual variation. The confidence the framework inspired was not always warranted, but it was very legible, and very legible frameworks spread very efficiently on the early internet. Drug cultures and music have been intertwined throughout modern history, and DXM was no exception, though its musical associations were more specific and more revealing than most. The dissociative, reality-bending quality of the DXM experience found a natural home in certain corners of the electronic music scene, particularly in the ambient drone and psychedelic genres that were flourishing in the early internet era. Users reported that specific albums were designed for or enhanced by the DXM experience, and these recommendations circulated through forums with the same earnestness applied to dosing guides. The cultural references embedded in DXM's community, the music, the films, the books, painted a picture of a subculture that understood itself as engaged in something more than just getting high. there was a quasi-philosophical dimension to the community, a shared belief that dissociative experiences offered access to altered states of consciousness that had genuine meaning. This was, in retrospect, both genuinely interesting and genuinely alarming in roughly equal measure. The musical canon of the DXM community reflected the sonic character of dissociation itself, long-form, textural, non-narrative music that created immersive sound environments rather than melodic structures designed to be followed consciously. Artists like Brian Eno, whose ambient work from the 1970s and 80s had been exploring similar perceptual territory from a compositional standpoint, appeared on DXM listening lists. The drone metal and dark ambient scenes of the 90s and early 2000s supplied additional material, music designed to be experienced as an environment rather than a performance, which suited a state of consciousness in which the boundary between self and surroundings was already substantially dissolved. Specific albums circulated as recommendations with a seriousness that suggested the community viewed the musical pairing as an essential component of the experience rather than an optional enhancement. Films occupied a similar space. Certain movies, particularly those with nonlinear narrative structures, heavy visual stylization, or themes of reality distortion and identity dissolution, circulated as DXM-compatible, viewing the way specific albums circulated as DXM-compatible listening. This isn't uncommon in psychedelic drug culture generally. The relationship between altered states and art that explores altered states is long-standing and bidirectional. Art influences the experience, and the experience changes the way the art is perceived. What was specific to the DXM community was the systematic organization of these recommendations, the way they were curated and shared with the same care applied to dosing information. The community was building a complete experiential framework: how to prepare, what to take, what to listen to, what to watch, what to read afterward. It was elaborate and detailed and built by teenagers who, in another context, would have channeled the same curatorial energy into something with fewer neurological consequences. The philosophical dimension, the belief that high-dose DXM provided access to meaningful altered states of consciousness, rather than simply a chemically induced impairment, was the most complex aspect of the community's self-understanding. Some members drew explicitly on psychedelic philosophy traditions, citing Aldous Huxley's writing on mescaline or Timothy Leary's framework for consciousness exploration. Others developed their own frameworks, describing the DXM experience in terms of ego dissolution, spiritual insight, and access to aspects of consciousness ordinarily inaccessible. Whether these experiences had the meaning attributed to them is a question that philosophy and neuroscience have been arguing about for a long time without resolution. What is clearer is that the meaning framework made the practice feel significant rather than merely reckless, and that significance for some users was part of the appeal. Drug education in American schools in the early 2000s was still largely structured around a model developed in the 1980s and 90s, designed to address marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and alcohol, the classic pharmacological lineup that had shaped drug policy for a generation. DXM fit none of the existing categories, which created a significant problem for school counselors and health educators who were trying to address it. You cannot simply pull out the existing DARE curriculum and apply it to cough syrup. The conversations that schools had to have about DXM required a different kind of nuance, acknowledging that medicine could be abused, explaining what over-the-counter actually meant in terms of safety, and doing all of this without making the subject so interesting that it served as an advertisement for the behaviour. Several school districts hired consultants. Others sent letters home to parents. Others did nothing, on the theory that raising awareness would spread the practice. The evidence suggests that silence was not, in fact, protective. The DARE program, which had been the dominant model for American school drug education since the mid-80s, was already under serious scrutiny in the early 2000s. Multiple rigorous studies had found that DARE-style education, focused on information provision, resistance skills training, and the cultivation of negative attitudes toward drug use, had little measurable effect on actual drug use rates. The program was not making teenagers less likely to use drugs. This was not a fringe finding. It was the consensus of the relevant research literature. The response of school districts to this finding varied enormously. Some maintained DARE regardless. Some transitioned to updated models, and some concluded that drug education as traditionally practiced was ineffective and directed resources elsewhere. Into this uncertain landscape arrived DXM, a substance that wasn't in any curriculum, wasn't in any training material, and required teachers and counsellors to have a conversation they had not been prepared to have. The specific challenge of DXM in school settings was the medicine cabinet problem. Standard drug education operates on a framework that distinguishes clearly between drugs, bad things that bad people do, and medicine, good things that doctors prescribe. DXM sits directly on the line between these categories because it is medicine. Teaching students that DXM abuse is dangerous requires simultaneously teaching them that cough syrup is medicine that most people use safely, that the danger is specific to high doses and recreational use, and that the substance itself is not inherently evil, just misused. This is a more nuanced message than the standard drug education model was designed to deliver. Nuance is also, historically, harder to teach than simple categorical rules, and harder to test for effectiveness. Schools that did address DXM directly reported mixed results. Some found that frank, factual discussions, led by health professionals or pharmacy consultants rather than classroom teachers, were well received by students and generated useful conversations. Others found that any mention of DXM in a school context resulted in an immediate spike in student internet searches for more information, which suggests that school-based awareness efforts were, in some cases, serving precisely the advertising function that cautious administrators had feared. The question of whether to talk about DXM in schools, and how and in what terms, and with what supporting infrastructure, was one that the education system was poorly equipped to answer quickly. It took years to develop approaches that were both accurate and pedagogically sound. By the time most schools had a coherent response, the peak of the epidemic had passed. One of the stranger regulatory debates of the DXM era revolved around pure DXM products, those containing DXM as the only active ingredient. From a harm reduction standpoint, pure DXM is far safer for a teenager who's going to abuse it than a combination product containing acetaminophen. Users who consumed pure DXM faced the risks inherent to high-dose dissociative use: disorientation, cardiac effects, neurological impact, but not the silent liver failure that combination products could produce. Yet the existence of pure, convenient DXM products also made it significantly easier to access large quantities of DXM without the natural deterrent of having to choke down multiple bottles of thick cherry-flavoured syrup. This is the essential paradox of harm reduction as applied to a legal substance. Making the harmful thing safer to do may, at the margin, encourage more people to do the harmful thing. There are no clean answers. Regulators, manufacturers, and advocates argued about this for years with genuine conviction on all sides. The debate sharpened considerably when pure DXM powder began appearing on the market through online vendors, sold, typically, as a research chemical, a legal formulation that was chemically identical to the active ingredient in Robitussin, but available in bulk quantities at concentrations far higher than any retail product. A gram of pure DXM powder contains enough active compound for multiple high-dose experiences. It is odorless and can be weighed and dosed precisely without consuming any volume of liquid. From a harm reduction perspective, precise dosing reduces the risk of accidental overdose. From a public health perspective, easily available, high-concentration DXM powder accessible via mail order represented a significant escalation of the accessibility problem that retail age restrictions were designed to address. The retail interventions that CVS and other chains implemented in 2007 had no effect whatsoever on the online powder market. Regulatory authority over DXM powder was complicated by its classification as a research chemical. The research chemical category, substances that are chemically distinct from or insufficiently similar to scheduled drugs to fall under the Controlled Substances Act, had been used since the 1980s as a mechanism for distributing analog substances that captured the psychoactive properties of scheduled drugs without technically meeting the legal definitions that triggered scheduling. DXM powder was not an analog. It was the actual compound found in approved medicines, but its sale as a research chemical occupied a similar legal space, and the FDA's authority to restrict the sale of a legal compound in a novel format was less clear than its authority to regulate labeled pharmaceutical products. Legal ambiguity, in the drug enforcement context, typically benefits the people doing the selling. The resolution of the pure product debate was ultimately pragmatic rather than philosophical. The development of bittering agents for retail products, combined with the gradual tightening of online vendor regulations through the mid-2010s, reduced the practical availability of both the most convenient retail options and the online bulk alternatives. Neither vector was fully closed. Both were made more difficult. The harm reduction paradox was never resolved in the abstract. It remains a genuine tension in drug policy thinking. But the specific manifestation of it in the DXM context was addressed through the accumulation of friction rather than through any single, decisive policy intervention. The DXM epidemic did not end with a single policy, a single regulatory change, or a single dramatic public health intervention. It ended the way most drug trends among young people end, gradually, through a combination of factors that are difficult to isolate and impossible to rank. Age restrictions at retail reduced access for younger teenagers. Product reformulations added deterrents. Greater awareness among parents, school counselors, and emergency physicians improved early identification. The internet itself evolved. The forums where DXM culture had flourished fragmented into newer platforms with different content dynamics. And perhaps most significantly, other substances arrived to compete for attention. The opioid epidemic was already beginning its devastating acceleration by the mid-2000s, and the cultural space occupied by DXM use was increasingly crowded by discussions of other, very different substances. Drug trends, like most trends, have a lifespan, and DXM's peak had passed before most of the country knew it had arrived. The role of competing substances in the decline of DXM use is one of the least comfortable aspects of this history, because it suggests that one drug crisis may have effectively displaced another, not through any intervention designed to reduce drug use overall, but through the simple dynamics of a market. Prescription opioids became dramatically more available in the early 2000s through a combination of aggressive pharmaceutical marketing, changes in prescribing culture, and the widespread belief, carefully cultivated and eventually proven false, that opioids like OxyContin carried a low risk of addiction. As opioids became more accessible in suburban medicine cabinets and through peer networks, they represented a more potent and, in some respects, more socially legible option than cough syrup for teenagers seeking intoxication. The DXM subculture's elaborate plateau system and philosophical framing could not compete with the direct pharmacological action of opioid reward circuitry. Some portion of the teenagers who might have experimented with DXM in a different landscape ended up experimenting with something considerably more dangerous instead. The DXM numbers fell. The opioid numbers climbed. This is not a comforting trade. The evolution of the internet also played a role in the decline that is difficult to quantify, but probably significant. The text-based forums where DXM culture had developed its infrastructure were, by the mid-2010s, less dominant as platforms than they had been in the early 2000s. Social media, Facebook and eventually Twitter and Instagram displaced much of the discussion that had previously occurred in forum environments. Social media platforms were more closely associated with real-world social identities than anonymous forums had been, which changed the social calculus around discussing drug use publicly. Content moderation had also improved significantly from the early YouTube era. The ecosystem in which DXM culture had grown was less hospitable than it had been, and while the information remained available, it was less prominently organized and less easily discovered than it had been at the epidemic's peak. The awareness factor is genuine but difficult to measure. Parents who knew about DXM could check medicine cabinets. Physicians who knew about it could ask about it. School counselors who knew about it could include it in conversations about substance use. None of these interventions work perfectly, but each of them works at the margin, and margins aggregate. The teenagers who didn't start because a parent had the right conversation, who got help earlier because a physician recognized the symptoms, who were deterred by an age restriction they didn't feel like working around. These cases don't appear in any data set as prevented harm, but they happened and they matter. For emergency medicine, toxicology, and pediatric healthcare, the DXM epidemic produced a body of clinical knowledge that, while assembled under deeply unfortunate circumstances, has genuinely improved medical practice. Physicians learned to screen specifically for DXM in adolescent overdose cases. Toxicologists developed better methods for identifying high-dose DXM intoxication. Emergency departments developed protocols for managing the full range of DXM-related presentations, from first plateau confusion to the terrifying fourth plateau cases that required intensive monitoring. The co-occurrence of DXM intoxication and acetaminophen toxicity became a recognized clinical pattern, and perhaps most valuably, the medical community developed a broader framework for thinking about over-the-counter substance abuse, an understanding that the legal status of a substance is not a reliable guide to its abuse potential, and that teenagers are creative, resourceful, and will find the gaps in any system not specifically designed to include them. The DXM case reports that began appearing in emergency medicine and toxicology journals in the early 2000s represent a specific kind of medical literature, the literature of the previously unknown. Case reports serve an important function in medicine precisely because they document the unusual, the presentations that fall outside existing frameworks, the combinations of findings that don't fit established diagnoses, the substances that aren't in the reference texts. A physician reading a DXM case report in 2003 is gaining knowledge that will help them recognize the next DXM case that walks into their emergency department. This is how clinical medicine updates itself in the face of new threats, not through formal studies, which take years to design and execute, but through the rapid dissemination of case experience through the literature. The physicians who published those early case reports were, in a meaningful sense, protecting the patients of colleagues they had never met. The acetaminophen co-occurrence lesson was probably the most clinically significant output of the epidemic years, because it established a management principle that had not previously been articulated. In adolescent cases of suspected DXM intoxication, always check acetaminophen levels, regardless of what the patient or their companions report. This seems simple in retrospect. It was not obvious before the pattern was identified. The teenagers who had unknowingly been consuming hepatotoxic quantities of acetaminophen while pursuing a DXM high had not reported acetaminophen use because they didn't think of it as a separate substance. it was just part of the cough syrup. The physician who ordered a comprehensive metabolic panel and found elevated liver enzymes in a patient presenting with DXM intoxication was seeing the consequence of that conceptual gap. Ordering the acetaminophen level as a routine part of the workup became standard practice in communities where DXM cases were occurring. The broader lesson, that over-the-counter status is not a reliable indicator of abuse potential, generalized beyond DXM to inform thinking about several other substances that occupy similar regulatory spaces. Diphenhydramine, the antihistamine in Benadryl, was already known to have abuse potential at high doses. Loperamide, the antidiarrheal drug sold as Imodium, would become the subject of its own concerning trend in the 2010s when users discovered that at extremely high doses it produced opioid-like effects. The DXM experience had taught the medical community to watch the medicine aisle with the same vigilance it applied to the street drug market. That lesson arrived at a cost. The medical community has tried to make the knowledge earned from it worth paying. The DXM epidemic sits at the edge of the broader conversation about drug policy in America, close enough to be relevant, far enough from the main narrative to be frequently omitted. It demonstrated in a very clear and documented way that the line between medicine and drug is not as bright as the pharmacy shelf would suggest. It demonstrated that legal availability does not mean safe availability, and that removing a substance from the controlled category does not remove its capacity for harm. It demonstrated that teenagers, given access to information and a degree of pharmacological curiosity, will find ways to use whatever is available, and that this is a predictable human behavior rather than an aberration requiring moral condemnation. And it demonstrated that the system designed to protect public health from pharmaceutical harm has significant gaps when the harm in question involves the product being used correctly, but at the wrong dose, by the wrong age group for the wrong reason. The policy lessons from DXM have been partially absorbed and partially ignored, which is the normal fate of policy lessons from drug crises that don't generate the kind of sustained national attention that drives comprehensive reform. The age restriction model, voluntary or legislatively mandated retail restrictions on DXM purchases, has been maintained and strengthened in most jurisdictions that implemented it. Product reformulations have persisted. Physician and pharmacist training has been updated. These are meaningful improvements. They represent a genuine, if imperfect, response to an identifiable harm. What has not happened is any fundamental rethinking of the regulatory framework that allowed the problem to develop. The assumption that over-the-counter approval, granted based on safety at recommended doses, adequately addresses the full range of risks associated with a substance when it is available without restriction to any member of the public who walks into a store. The loperamide situation in the 2010s illustrated exactly this gap. Loperamide, sold as Imodium for the entirely benign purpose of treating diarrhea, became, in the context of the opioid crisis, a substance abused at extremely high doses by people seeking opioid effects. The mechanism is different from DXM, the population is different, the clinical presentation is different, but the underlying dynamic is structurally identical. An over-the-counter product, approved for safety at recommended doses, accessible without restriction, discovered by a motivated population to have effects at higher doses that its approval process did not contemplate. The DXM lesson, if it had been fully internalized, might have accelerated the response to loperamide. The evidence suggests the learning was partial. The medicine cabinet will always be there. The curious teenager will always be there. The internet, in whatever form it takes in any given decade, will always be there, providing information that the teenager finds faster than any regulatory or educational system can suppress it. The DXM epidemic was not a unique event. It was an example of a recurring dynamic that the structure of American pharmaceutical regulation generates predictably. Every substance that is both widely available and capable of producing significant psychoactive effects at super-therapeutic doses is a potential candidate for the same trajectory. DXM was not the first. Loperamide was not the last. The question is not whether it will happen again. It is which shelf it will come from next. DXM remains in over-the-counter products in the United States as of this recording, regulated by a patchwork of state age restrictions and voluntary retailer policies that have meaningfully reduced but not eliminated adolescent access. The FDA has continued to monitor the issue. Several states have passed laws restricting sales. Some manufacturers have maintained reformulations that reduce or deter abuse, and the internet, which did so much to spread awareness of recreational DXM use in the late 90s and early 2000s, now contains just as much content warning against it, though whether the warnings reach the same audiences as the trip reports is a question that does not have a comforting answer. The history of DXM is, in the end, a history of a drug that was hiding in plain sight, on every pharmacy shelf, in every medicine cabinet, in a bottle with a friendly cough on the label, waiting for someone to read the ingredient list a little too carefully and wonder what would happen if they took a lot more than it said. California's legislation restricting DXM sales to those 18 and older, passed in 2010, remains one of the most comprehensive state-level responses to the issue and has served as a model for subsequent legislative efforts in other jurisdictions. As of recent years, multiple states have enacted similar restrictions, and the Consumer Healthcare Products Association, the trade group representing manufacturers of over-the-counter medicines, has supported voluntary retailer age verification as an industry standard. These are not small achievements. They represent a genuine and durable shift in how DXM is managed at the retail level, driven by a combination of legislative action, voluntary industry initiative, and sustained advocacy by the parent community that formed in the wake of the epidemic's worst years. The online market for pure DXM powder remains a persistent challenge. The substances are sold through vendor networks that operate in regulatory spaces that are difficult to reach with standard pharmaceutical regulations, and they are accessible to anyone with a credit card and a shipping address. Adolescents who are sufficiently motivated and informed can access high-concentration DXM outside the retail system without encountering the friction that age restrictions and behind-the-counter policies create at the pharmacy. This is not a new problem, and it does not have an easy solution. The online chemical vendor ecosystem operates faster and adapts more quickly than the regulatory machinery designed to address it. The gap between what is technically legal and what is practically harmful remains a space in which motivated users can operate. What has changed in the 2 decades since the DXM epidemic peaked is the general level of awareness. Parents in 2025 are far more likely to have heard of DXM abuse than parents in 2003 were. School curricula are more likely to include it. Physicians are more likely to screen for it. The information ecosystem now contains warnings alongside the trip reports, and the warnings are more prominently placed than they were in the early forum era. None of this is sufficient by itself. Awareness does not eliminate access. Knowledge does not eliminate curiosity. The medicine cabinet is still there, and the internet is still there, and some version of a teenager reading a label too carefully and asking the wrong question will probably always be there too. The DXM epidemic is not over in the way that a chapter of history is over. It is managed, it is reduced, it is watched more carefully than it was before, and the bottle is still on the shelf, right there between the antacids and the vitamin C, exactly where it has always been. DXM remains in over-the-counter products in the United States as of this recording, regulated by a patchwork of state age restrictions, and voluntary retailer policies that have meaningfully reduced but not eliminated adolescent access. The FDA has continued to monitor the issue. Several states have passed laws restricting sales. Some manufacturers have maintained reformulations that reduce or deter abuse. And the internet, which did so much to spread awareness of recreational DXM use in the late 90s and early 2000s, now contains just as much content warning against it. Though whether the warnings reach the same audiences as the TRIP reports is a question that does not have a comforting answer. The history of DXM is, in the end, a history of a drug that was hiding in plain sight, on every pharmacy shelf, in every medicine cabinet, in a bottle with a friendly cough on the label, waiting for someone to read the ingredient list a little too carefully and wonder what would happen if they took a lot more than it said. California's legislation restricting DXM sales to those 18 and older, passed in 2010, remains one of the most comprehensive state-level responses to the issue and has served as a model for subsequent legislative efforts in other jurisdictions. As of recent years, multiple states have enacted similar restrictions, and the Consumer Healthcare Products Association, the trade group representing manufacturers of over-the-counter medicines, has supported voluntary retailer age verification as an industry standard. These are not small achievements. They represent a genuine and durable shift in how DXM is managed at the retail level, driven by a combination of legislative action, voluntary industry initiative, and sustained advocacy by the parent community that formed in the wake of the epidemic's worst years. The mothers and fathers who sat in legislative hearing rooms and spoke about their children did not solve the problem, but they moved it measurably, documentably, in a direction that has protected teenagers who will never know they were protected. The federal picture is more complicated. Congress has considered but not passed comprehensive federal legislation establishing a national minimum age for DXM purchases, which means the regulatory landscape remains inconsistent across state lines in a way that creates obvious workarounds for motivated adolescents in restricted states. A teenager in a state with an age restriction who drives 20 minutes to a neighbouring state without one is not a theoretical scenario. It is a documented behaviour, noted in the enforcement discussions that followed state-level legislative implementation. The argument for federal standardization is straightforward. A patchwork of state laws with different thresholds, different enforcement mechanisms, and different penalties creates gaps that are easily exploited. The counter-argument, equally straightforward, is that federal regulation of over-the-counter medicine sales is a significant expansion of federal authority into an area traditionally managed at the state and local level, and that the pharmaceutical industry lobby has considerable resources available for expressing its views on that expansion. The federal bill has not passed. The gaps remain. The online market for pure DXM powder remains a persistent and genuinely difficult challenge. These substances are sold through vendor networks that operate in regulatory spaces that are hard to reach with standard pharmaceutical regulations, and they are accessible to anyone with a credit card and a shipping address. No age verification, no pharmacist interaction, no behind-the-counter friction, just a website, a payment form, and a package in the mail that looks, from the outside, like any other small parcel. Adolescents who are sufficiently motivated and informed can access high-concentration DXM outside the retail system without encountering a single one of the barriers that years of advocacy and legislation have built into the pharmacy experience. The online chemical vendor ecosystem operates faster and adapts more quickly than the regulatory machinery designed to address it. When one vendor is shut down, others appear. When one payment processor refuses to work with chemical vendors, another accepts them. The gap between what is technically legal and what is practically harmful remains a space in which motivated users can operate with a degree of ease that would have seemed extraordinary to anyone who thought, in 2007, that the problem had been substantially addressed. What has genuinely changed in the 2 decades since the DXM epidemic peaked is awareness, and awareness, while insufficient by itself, is not nothing. Parents in 2025 are dramatically more likely to have heard of DXM abuse than parents in 2003 were. School health curricula are more likely to include it alongside the traditional substance abuse topics. Pediatricians are more likely to ask about it during adolescent wellness visits. Emergency physicians are more likely to screen for it and to check acetaminophen levels as a matter of routine in any adolescent presenting with altered mental status. Pharmacists are trained to recognize purchasing patterns that suggest abuse. The entire professional infrastructure surrounding adolescent health has been updated, at least partially, to include DXM as a known risk rather than an unknown one. This is the accumulated product of 20 years of case reports, advocacy, legislative testimony, medical education, and the quiet persistence of the parent community that refused to let the issue disappear from the conversation after the media cycle moved on. The poison control data reflect this. Call volumes related to DXM abuse have declined from their peak in the mid-2000s, particularly in the youngest adolescent cohorts, the 12 to 15 age group where retail restrictions have had their most measurable effect. The trend is real. The improvement is real. It is also partial, uneven across geographies, and dependent on the continued maintenance of systems that require active effort to sustain. Awareness fades, training becomes outdated. New cohorts of teenagers arrive who have not heard the warnings that were given to the previous cohort. The work is not finished in the way that work on a completed project is finished. It is ongoing, like most public health work, a continuous effort to hold ground that would otherwise be lost, and to make incremental progress against a problem that does not go away simply because it has been partially addressed. None of this is sufficient by itself. Awareness does not eliminate access. Knowledge does not eliminate curiosity. The medicine cabinet is still there, and the internet is still there, and some version of a teenager reading a label too carefully and asking the wrong question will probably always be there too. This is not a counsel of despair. It is simply an accurate description of the landscape. The DXM epidemic is not over in the way that a chapter of history is over. It is managed. It is reduced. It is watched more carefully than it was. The systems around it are better than they were, and the people working on it are better informed than they were, and the teenagers at highest risk are somewhat more protected than they were. That is genuine progress, bought at a real cost, maintained through ongoing effort, and the bottle is still on the shelf, right there between the antacids and the vitamin C, in the cheerful packaging with the little figure breathing easily on the front, exactly where it has always been, just waiting for someone to read the label one more time. And so here you are, still breathing, hopefully still horizontal, somewhere between almost asleep and just awake enough to have followed all of that. The labs, the forums, the cherry-flavoured syrup, the locked pharmacy cases, the parents in the hearing rooms, the emergency rooms at 2 a.m, and one very complicated bottle that has been sitting on the shelf since 1958, quietly minding its business and occasionally destroying someone's Friday night. Take a breath, a slow one, through your nose, not because you're a medieval peasant managing frostbite, just because it feels right at this hour. Tonight you travelled somewhere strange, not a battlefield, not a dungeon, not a plague-ridden medieval village, but a CVS, a suburban bedroom, a dimly lit internet forum full of teenagers who thought they had done their research. In some ways, it is the most modern story we have told on this channel. No castles, no kings, no ancient civilizations crumbling under the weight of their own ambition. Just a compound in a cough syrup, a gap in a regulatory framework, and a generation of young people who found it before anyone thought to close the door, and yet the shape of it is as old as anything we have covered here. The same human pattern repeating itself across centuries. Something powerful is introduced into the world for a good reason by people with good intentions who did not fully understand what they were handing over. The Romans didn't know what lead pipes were doing to their water. The medieval apothecary didn't know what was living in the herbs he was grinding into paste. The 1950s laboratory didn't know what a curious teenager in 2002 would find in the ingredient list of a cough suppressant. And the people who suffered the consequences of those gaps were not the ones who created them. They were the youngest, the most curious, the most invisible to the systems designed to protect them. That is the thread that runs through every episode of this channel. Whether we're talking about medieval peasants banking their fires against the winter cold, or teenagers in suburban America finding plateaus in a cough syrup aisle. The systems built to protect people are built by people who can only see the problems they have already encountered. The problems that haven't happened yet are invisible until they arrive, and the people who pay the price for that invisibility are almost always the ones least equipped to advocate for themselves. So tonight, before you drift off, consider the parents who showed up to legislative hearings they didn't know how to navigate, in buildings they had never been inside, using language they had learned in the month since a phone call changed everything, and kept showing up year after year in rooms where most people had moved on to the next crisis. Consider the school nurses who noticed something was wrong before anyone had given them a name for it. Consider the emergency physicians who published case reports at midnight after their shifts because they wanted the next physician to recognize what they had just seen. Consider the teenagers themselves, the ones who didn't make it, and the ones who did, and the ones who were quietly not there because someone, somewhere, had done enough of this unglamorous and unrecognized work to put a small amount of friction between them and a decision they might not have survived. History is not only the grand sweep of empires and pandemics and revolutions that rearrange the map, it is also this: a bottle on a shelf, a warning label nobody read carefully enough, and the long, slow, imperfect work of people who decided that was not acceptable, and kept saying so until someone finally listened. The bottle is still there. So are the people watching it. Sleep well tonight. You have earned it. And the medicine cabinet will still be there in the morning, smaller, watched more carefully, slightly less dangerous than it was 20 years ago, and still not entirely solved, which is, honestly, the most human ending the story could have.